I'm here today with Marilyn McEntyre. Marilyn's a writer and has been a professor of literature and medical humanities at UC Berkeley and New College, Berkeley. Marilyn is the author of over 15 books, including Caring for Words in a Culture of Lies and Word by Word. She's won several outstanding teaching awards and several outstanding book awards. Her writing has appeared in the Christian Century, Weaving, Sojourners, Prism, Conversations, Christianity Today, and some medical periodicals, and a variety of other academic and trade publications. She leads retreats and workshops, and she has been a featured speaker at the Frederick Buechner Writers Conference and Writing for Your Life conferences. And so it's always a pleasure to have you with us, Marilyn. Thanks for joining us.
That's a pleasure for me.
So you've got such an illustrative background. You know, I mean, you've done so many wonderful books and so many other great things. Can you kind of give folks a little bit more of a flavor of that than what, you know, the brief introduction is that I just gave?
Well, I love to write, and part of the work that I've done as in English departments and as a professor is in the hope of helping other people love to write. And so a lot of my life work has been focused on literature, to be sure, but on language and on words and paying attention to the words that we use. So about 10 years ago, I decided to make a shift from being a teacher who writes to being a writer who teaches. And so in about the past decade, I have continued to teach courses at Berkeley, courses for Westmont, courses for seminaries, but those are woven into a life that's been a pretty steady practice of writing. And I was very gratified when my spiritual director at one point said, I was worried that I wasn't spending enough time in prayer and meditation. And she said, well, I think I know you well enough to say that your writing life is an extension of your prayer life. And I was grateful for that, not just because it gave me an excuse to write more, but because that's what I think writing should be and can be, which is just a practice of receiving. So yeah, a lot of the work that I've done in the last years has been focused on language and spirituality and healing and how those things intersect.
Oh, that's very cool. So tell us a little bit more about, you know, some of the books that you've already written.
Well, I think the one that has been most defining for me and seems to have been useful to other people is Caring for Words in a Culture of Lies, which I actually wrote in 2009. I was concerned then about the nature of public discourse, especially political discourse, but the kinds of conflicts that were going on nationally and also in churches and in faith communities that were not reducible to semantic differences, but certainly came down to how we use language, how we talk about God, how we talk about evil or sin or healing or the sacredness of life. And so I began to pay more attention to the words in the conversation themselves, the words as currency. And Caring for Words was an effort to get at what are some of the ways we can learn to be good stewards of language. So I used this metaphor all the way through of language care and earth care, and looked at some of the ways ecologists talk about caring for the soil that is being depleted or caring for the rainforests or the ocean. And in a similar way, words can be eroded and contaminated and rendered unusable. And so the question that governed the book was, how do we retrieve them? How do we make them life-giving and lively again? And so I went through what I call 12 strategies of stewardship. How do we be good users and preservers of language? It's not a simple issue, and I didn't approach it as an academic linguist. It was really my reflection on the what do you mean question. That's such a healthy question, that if all of us would just pause more frequently to say, wait, what do I mean? What do you mean? Could you tell me what you mean? Then I'll get involved in really backtracking and saying, how do I use that word? If I use a word like justice or peace or fair or God. Just the what do you mean question is so rich. So that's what that book was about. And that led to a book about phrases that came out of a practice of Lectio Divina, just letting myself sit with a phrase, see where it moved me. And then word by word was a practice of sitting with a single word for a week and writing a reflection on that word each day for a week. And that book seems to have been appealing to a range of readers, and that's been gratifying because I loved the practice. And part of writing it was to encourage other people to try it. Go home and try this.
So would you say that the usage of words has gotten worse since you wrote Caring for Words?
Oh, yes, that's why a second edition of it is coming.
Good. Well, it needs to be read again or read by many people who didn't read it the first time. I totally agree.
I think so. I mean, I think political discourse for a long time has suffered from an epidemic of abstraction. And that's really apart from the vicious language or the vulgar language that's become distressingly more acceptable in public. But I'm just talking about the level of abstractions that don't mean anything. And where people don't insist on clear definitions, often even in documents, public documents, or people who deal with abstractions about happiness or justice or peace, or slogans. When things are reduced to slogans, it's so easy to just have knee-jerk responses to them rather than pausing and saying, let's unpack this a little bit. Exactly what does it mean? And of course, you can't do that when you're in the middle of a protest. And I think there's a place for legitimate, peaceful protest that's getting impinged upon. But creating spaces for conversation that includes reflection on the very language we're using seems to me to be a timely mission for churches and schools and book groups, anywhere people gather around words to try to reflect on what matters.
Well, it feels to me that, our society's reading level and use of language has definitely deteriorated over my lifetime.
Yeah, and I don't have statistics on hand, but there are a lot of studies to corroborate that.
Yeah. So, trying to resurrect language and meaning behind language is pretty important at the end of the day. When the world
Right.
is, devolved to, sound bites, right? Media sound bites. That's a tough battle to overcome.
Yeah, and I want to hasten to say, because someone asked me this when Caring for Words first came out, that it's not an argument for standardized English. I actually think a lot of the vitality in spoken language now comes from the streets, where people are exchanging often very colloquial words, but they have life to them, and sometimes a lot of anger. But that out at those edges, those places where people live and come up with their own slang and their idioms, sometimes involve really colorful metaphor or images that we need to be aware of. So I think we need the kind of edgy uses of language, and it is the nature of language to evolve. So I'm also wouldn't make an argument that language needs to be static. If you think about the life of the soil, to go back to that analogy, somebody said there are more life forms in a square foot of soil than on, than on the rest of the planet, the larger life forms. But just to say, there are lots of things going on in a square foot of soil, and there are lots of layers of what's happening when you use a word or when you put a sentence together. And so I think what I call the meta conversation, just the habit in conversation of saying, what do you mean? Or, yeah, I wonder where that word came from. Or when you say conservative, I wonder if it means the same as when I say conservative or liberal or progressive, just to take some obvious examples. And the other thing is, if you take a slogan like Black Lives Matter, that is such an important idea. But those ideas, when they become slogans, start becoming sort of political footballs. And so the people who make the slogans and use them need also always to be surrounded with people who hold the slogan in front of them and say, yes, and so what does that mean? What does that mean for us in terms of action? What does it mean? What are its implications? Does it mean other lives don't matter? No. So why do we insist on this? So, I mean, a slogan is an invitation to a conversation, but too often, because of the nature of headlines and the flashy nature of a lot of social media transactions, things get reduced to slogans. Instead of the slogan being a starting point, it becomes an end point.
So the latest book that you are just coming out with is called Where the Eye Alights, from Erdman's. And let me just read a brief description about that. Lent is about more than going to church on weekdays and giving up chocolate or social media. It's also a time to form one's heart and mind through study and prayer. In Where the Eye Alights, Marilyn McEntyre offers 40 short meditations based on excerpts from scripture and poetry that guide readers on a devotional journey from Ash Wednesday through Holy Saturday. As in Lectio Divina, the spiritual practice of reading scripture repetitively and meditatively, McEntyre invites us to notice words that may give us pause and summon us to reflection. This book calls our attention to how the Spirit speaks through phrases that can open doors to deep places for those willing to sit still with them. So Marilyn, maybe you could tell us first just a little bit about how this book came about.
Well, it came about very similarly to What's in a Phrase, which was another earlier book, which I already mentioned came out of a practice of Lectio Divina. And I think that both Catholics and Protestants pretty widely understand and use this practice now, but just to review it is to say it's an ancient Benedictine practice of reading scripture, I would say deeply subjectively, listening for the guidance of the Holy Spirit, so that as you read a short passage, you listen for a word or phrase that stops you. Somebody said, you listen for the word or phrase that shimmers. I like that. But just something strikes you and you notice yourself having a little bit of a response like, yeah, I haven't thought about that. Or I love that word. Or what a peculiar image. But it's not even really a thought process. Just noticing and pausing where it gives you pause is the practice. And so I have been interested also in teaching poetry and how that practice of listening for a word or phrase rather than for an idea or a sentence or a claim or an argument, just to listen for a phrase like love in the open hand is a phrase I love from a Edmund St. Vincent Millay sonnet. That's actually one of the phrases I write about in here. Or,
What was it? Could you repeat that phrase again?
Love in the open hand.
Love in the open hand.
Yeah, it's from this sonnet that ends, love in the open hand, no thing but that, ungemmed, unhidden, wishing not to hurt, as one would bring you cowslips in a hat swung from the hand, or apples in her skirt, I bring you, calling out as children do, look what I have, and these are all for you. It's a beautiful, it's not really sentimental, but it's a lovely sonnet about a quality of love that is very human and very childlike, and I think has something to do with the kind of love that Jesus talked about. So love in the open hand was one of the phrases. And so this practice of stopping over a phrase opens a little door of reflection, but it doesn't close down on an idea. And these days, in writing courses that I've taken to telling people to just avoid ideas for a while. Let's just not try to have ideas. Let's have some words and see what happens when you put them on the same line. There's a kind of chemistry to words themselves and a resonance and a lively quality that gets damp down if you just instrumentalize them as vehicles for larger ideas.
So, as an engineer in my background, my mind works a certain way, and I'm kind of amazed that your mind works much more complexly and differently than my simple engineering mind does.
It's more complexly, but it may start in a different part of the brain.
Yeah, exactly. So as I said, that book is just now available from Erdman's, and obviously very appropriate for the Lent season coming up. But you've also had 2 additional books coming out later this year, which 3 in a year is pretty serious, even though I know one is a reissue, but still, could you tell us a little bit about those 2?
Yeah, well, I've already mentioned that there's a new edition of Caring for Words coming out, because I wrote the earlier one in 2009, so a number of my references to slogans and language that was in common circulation at the time on social media and in the mainstream media, I thought were a little bit dated. And so, again, I expect that my political sensibilities are very evident in the book, but I haven't named names or tried to point fingers at who are the offenders, because I think that the language issues we're facing are pervasive. And it's like we live in a language environment that's very similar to the polluted air that a lot of us have to breathe in cities. It's not one person's fault. I think that our examination of conscience on any number of issues needs to be not only what have I done? Have I lied or cheated or stolen or committed adultery or something? Or, I mean, those are all good questions, but what am I participating in? What am I contributing to? Those seem to me to be very important moral questions that can be brought into language use. Not just am I using bad language, but am I using language that really serves clarity and compassion and opens the door for a deeper conversation with people and a livelier one, and is inviting and makes the space around me safe, and also challenges people? Or am I using language in such a way as to shut people down and make them feel less than or belittled or afraid? Yeah. So, and I don't know that we have for some time in the United States paid the quality of attention to language that some other cultures do. John McWhorter, who's a linguist, used to be at Berkeley. I think he's at Columbia or somewhere now, but he's written quite a bit about the fact that in France, for instance, there's a lot of conversation about language you can run into. He's a linguist, so he's sensitive to it. But he said the French really value French. A beautiful sentence is a beautiful thing for a French person, and of course it is for some of us too. But he just said that general sense that the language itself is a national treasure is something that Americans have not tended to cultivate.
That's for sure. That's very clear.
Yeah.
And that's a good, kind of like, I don't know, a good description of how the French view the world more broadly, right? I mean, in terms of the beauty of language. Well, they tend to pay attention more to the beauty of lots of other things.
Yeah, beauty. I think aesthetics and the relationship between aesthetic questions and moral questions is probably slightly differently calibrated for the French or other European countries than here for all kinds of reasons. And I think some of it has to do with the vitality of multiculturalism, but also the ways in which some of what more homogenous cultures preserve gets somewhat diluted. I don't know. I don't want to go into big claims that don't deserve to be made without more conversation.
Sure.
I think just to name some of the strategies of stewardship that I go into in that book, it starts with just love words. Just love words, play with them, play around with words, make jokes, make puns, make poems, but pause and say, wait, where did that word come from? My husband and I play Scrabble these days because here we are in our house and it's the pandemic and we aren't going out, but we've taken to playing Scrabble as part of our rituals when we're relaxing. And we just give each other lots of permission to sit there with a pile of dictionaries and include the languages we know other than English and look things up. And it's really been fun to find out what's a word. And can I just say that what we discovered the other day is that there's a Welsh word spelled HWYL, and it means a feeling of impassioned desire for eloquence. So that's my word of the week.
Oh, that's great. If you work that into your next book, yeah.
I'm going to put that somewhere.
Yes, it deserves it.
So love words is one chapter. Another chapter is tell the truth, but that's followed by a chapter I really was glad to write called Don't Tolerate Lies. And that has certainly applied over the last years as we see and we have documented. Responsible journalists have documented so many lies told to Congress, lies told in public. And I think that we're all complicit to the extent that we put up with or normalize lying. And so I think not tolerating lies is part of our civic responsibility and moral responsibility. And then there's another chapter on practicing poetry and how many cultures honor the place of poetry as public work rather differently than we do. And I would love to see poetry brought into the public spaces more regularly, not just coffee houses where people go to each other's poetry readings. But people in some very oppressed cultures understand that the poets are the people who mind the language to articulate the thing that lies at the heart of our common life in some way that brings it alive for people. And then there's another chapter on practicing translation. All of us are translators. Anybody who's a professional, like you're an engineer, that's your training. If I asked you a question about engineering, you'd have to craft it in such a way that it would be available for my very small understanding of what engineers do. And so we translate across, those of us who live in California hear multiple languages often. There are 75 different language groups in LA public school districts.
Wow.
Yeah. So imagine teaching in those classrooms, right? We're always working at the edge of language cultures that we don't belong to. So there's that literal dimension of translation. But I also think that we're trying to translate when we speak about our faith commitments to people who don't share them, or even across denominational lines among Christians. When you talk about, when you use a word like, I don't know, salvation, you might mean something slightly different than I do. And even when I say the creed, I think about how many ways I've heard some of the words in the creed used. We share it as a statement of faith, but it doesn't mean the same thing to everybody. So we need to keep looking at those words. See, I could go on about this a long time.
Yes. No, it's really fascinating. So,
Yeah.
but I do want to get to the third book, that you're going to be coming out with later this year too. Can you just say a few words about that?
Yeah. So the third book that's coming out is called Dear Doctor. And what we haven't said in this interview is that a good bit of my work over the last couple of decades has been partly in medical humanities, working with medical students, pre-med students, sometimes professional groups, healthcare workers on writing, reflective writing for med students, but also on looking at the language dimension of medical practice and how we talk about illness or death and dying. I've done hospice work where I just love working with hospice people and being able to witness people in that last stretch of life. But it sure makes me aware of all the language we bring to death and dying. It's a moment when people's spirituality really comes into the foreground. And a lot of people don't know how to talk about it because they're not, quote, religious, but something is happening to them at a spiritual level. So helping to equip families and people with language for what they're going through is part of the work. And so this book that's coming out later is looking at the encounter between doctors and patients and how whittled down it has become and how kind of penned in by, I don't know, the time constraints and the ways in which insurance companies demand that things be documented and the ways doctors have to now sit at their computers to fill in the forms. It means that the more we check boxes and fill in forms, less actual conversation we have. And so I tried to focus it on a question a doctor friend of mine posed to her interns, which is, if you had 2 extra minutes with a patient, how would you use them?
Hmm.
And her point was, you can do a lot in 2 minutes. There's actually a doctor in New York, Danielle Alfrey, who has a wonderful wide range of publications. And she has, on occasion, brought a poem to a patient's bedside with her interns and read that poem with them. And they would be poems that would articulate something about the experience of this condition. And so Dear Doctor was just looking at ways in which even brief clinical encounters might be enriched and humanized and made more imaginative, and doors might be open for a patient to offer information that might in fact turn out to be medically relevant, even if that's not something doctors tend to ask. So I have no idea if this is going to be offensive to people who practice medicine. It's a terrible time for the book to come out because we're in the middle of a pandemic. So I don't want in any way to suggest that doctors should be doing more than they are. But I think all of us need to be thoughtful, maybe more thoughtful than we're allowed to in institutional contexts, about the experience of illness and life-threatening illness that so many people are going through now. And find ways to talk about it that are life-giving instead of crushing.
Wow. Well, that sounds like an important book for us all to read. So we'll definitely look forward to that coming out later this year.
Thank you.
So Marilyn, it's always a pleasure to spend time with you. Thank you so much for all of your important work. You've written so many incredible books and very helpful on multiple levels. So thank you for that. And again, this latest book is Where the Eye Alights from Erdman's. It's a Lenten oriented book. So hope you can all enjoy that. And we'll get back in touch, Marilyn, when those other books are ready to come out. We'll talk more about those.
Thank you, Brian. Real pleasure to see you.
Okay, thank you.